there, this is Dennis. This is my second ranking video, and today I'm going to tackle one of the big groups, Pink Floyd. I've listened to Pink Floyd ever since the early 70s, although a lot of the first albums I heard were actually made before that. Pink Floyd kind of had like four phases of music. The first phase was a real psychedelic kind of adventurous, different kinds of music. They jammed a lot, played live at like the UFO Club and stuff. It's as far as albums goes, it's mostly noted for the early psychedelic singles and the first two albums. The second phase is a phase I like to call between the soundtracks. It starts off with the soundtrack from More and ends with the soundtrack from Obscured by Clouds. And this is their extremely experimental period. It's not exactly psychedelic like their first two albums, but it is very adventurous. They were trying different things and seeing what would work. Then the third one, the third phase, is where they became a household name. That's the most people who know Pink Floyd know these next albums, which starts with Dark Side of the Moon and basically ends with the Final Cut. Then their fourth phase is the one without Roger Waters. It's the David Gilmour led phase. And they did three albums in the 80s and 90s that were a little more radio friendly. And then after 2016, I believe it was, there was no more Pink Floyd releases. So anyway, let's get started. Okay, my least favorite album, which I don't have a copy of right now, in fact there's like three albums I don't have a copy of, is A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Now my problem with this album is, like a lot of people, is the 80s production. It's really strong, a lot of electronic drums and stuff, and Nick Mason's on the album, but he's not on it very much. Richard Wright is on it, but he's not even considered a member at this point. He's like a guest on it. And it's also very safe. It's not an adventurous album like their earlier stuff. It does have a couple instrumentals, but it doesn't have the long sequences and stuff like albums like Animals and none of the other long singles, or the long tracks. And that's why it's the lowest one on the rank. Now I will tell you that all the Pink Floyd albums had some good stuff in them. There's not a Pink Floyd album that didn't have some good stuff in it. But at the bottom of my list is A Momentary Lapse of Reason. The next album, which I also don't have, is The Division Bell. It's their last regular album. It isn't their last studio album altogether, but it is their last regular album with regular songs on it. And it is also a David Gilmour led album. But this time, Richard Wright is back as a full member. Nick Mason's playing more drums on that album. And it is an improvement over Momentary Lapse of Reason. But it still is one of those albums that's not very adventurous. It's safe. And it's not as exciting as their earlier stuff. Now the next one on my list, which I also don't have, is, well, no, I do have the next one. Where's The Final Cut. Now, if Momentary Lapse of Reason was a David Gilmour solo album, then this is like a Roger Waters solo album. Richard Wright was gone from the group at this point. Nick Mason and David Gilmour didn't have much input at all in it. It was basically Roger Waters the whole way, although David Gilmour still has some nice guitar solos. It's a very downbeat album. A lot of people who like Pink Floyd, which is kind of a very serious and somewhat downbeat group at times, consider this one extra downbeat. And that's just, it's worth a listen, but it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea. My next album, and this is the last one I don't have, is The Wall. Now, I know that's a controversial thing because The Wall is actually very well done. It's got some good songs, some really good songs on it. It tells a kind of an interesting story. I mean, it was worthwhile for them to make a movie about it, featuring the songs, the same song, different takes of the same songs that appear on the album. And it is a good album. and it was a very, very popular album. It's a double album, and it's just not my favorite because like I said, it's missing a lot of the long pieces, the long stretches of music and stuff that I'm used to with Pink Floyd. And it was the first Pink Floyd album I bought that was a little bit of a disappointment. I've grown to like it more now, and although I don't have it, I tend to get it. I do like the album enough to want it in my collection. And I mean, that's about it. That's my next one. Now from here on, every one of these albums I like quite a bit. The next one is the soundtrack from More. Now, although this has got some really good songs on it, I like Cirrus Minor, the Nile Song, um, Cymbeline, the Crying Song. I mean, Green is the Color. It's got some really good songs, but there's something about the way they're put together, and a couple of little short pieces like a Spanish piece and the party sequence that really feel like they were just kind of tacked onto the album. Although, they were in a movie. In fact, the Spanish piece, or I mean, not the Spanish piece, but the party sequence was actually a lot longer in the movie. But it has got some great songs, especially on side one, but it's just not a very cohesive album. The next one is the other soundtrack, Obscured by Clouds. Now we're getting into albums that are pretty good. I like Obscured by Clouds quite a bit. Although it's a soundtrack, it does flow pretty good as an album. Some of the best things on it are some of the instrumentals, but there's also some pretty good tracks on it. It's The Gold's in the, and Free For, Stay's a pretty good ballad, kind of a love song. It's probably one of the few they did that was like that. Yeah, that's where that one sits. The next one, Uma Guma. Probably one of the strangest albums ever to be considered a pop album. Uma Guma is a double album, one of two that they did. But the first album is a live album of music that had been played at their live recordings. One of them was a single and the other two were off of their first two albums. And these pieces are extended on here. They're actually, for the most part, better than the studio versions. The second album is very, very experimental, truly avant-garde album that has each member of the band gives a half a side of an album. Richard Wright has a multi-part piece called Sisyphus. Roger Waters has a couple of individual tracks. And David Gilmour has another 3-part piece, and Nick Mason has a 3-part piece. They are interesting, but they are really, really not, there's nothing about them that's like what you'd call anywhere near radio friendly. They're very experimental, avant-garde, a little bit maybe based on classical music, a little bit, especially Richard Wright's, but there's a lot of weird stuff going on there. And this album is definitely not everybody's cup of tea. Nice cover though. Next one, Saucer Full of Secrets. Now this is the only Pink Floyd album that has all 5 members on the album, although rarely on any one track. In fact, there's only one track, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, that has all 5 members on it. The rest of them, there's like 3 tracks that have David Gilmour on them and 3 tracks that have Syd Barrett on. And the last piece that Syd Barrett wrote for album is at the end of this album. It's pretty good. It's a pretty good album. The next one, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. This is a pretty fascinating album. It's got a terrific childlike feeling and innocence about it. Stories about mom telling Syd Barrett tales and stuff like that, and there's things about gnomes, scarecrows, and there's also some adventurous jamming tracks, some pretty strange tracks. But 11 of the 10 was that there's 11 pieces on the album, but 10 of them were mostly Syd Barrett tracks. The only track that Syd Barrett didn't have much to do with is Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk, which is a Roger Waters track, his first one. And that's where that one sits. Here's another controversial one. I bet Dark Side of the Moon next. Most people would have Dark Side of the Moon at number 1. no doubt that this is a fine, fine album. And in fact, it's like on the charts for almost 400 weeks. I mean, it's just like did amazingly well. Many consider it one of the greatest albums ever made. It had Alan Parsons engineering, and boy, does that show! It's like really, this is a fantastic album to show off your stereo equipment with, and it's got fantastic lyrics. It's got interesting music in it. It's got terrific guitar solos. I mean, it's just a fine album all around. The next one, Atom Heart Mother. Now this one, along with Umaguma, is two albums that the band themselves didn't care for, although I think they were a little bit unfair with this one. And like Umaguma, the second half of it has got tracks by each member. Although the last track, Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, is credited to the whole band, it had more to do with Nick Mason than anybody else. Side one of it, the Atom Heart Mother Suite, is a side-long piece that has an orchestra, and they also had the help of a guy named Ron Geeson, and it is a pretty interesting track. I mean, some people might think it drags on a little bit, but it has multiple parts. I think it's done really, really well. And that's where that one is. This next one, I'm often tempted to put a little bit higher. This is a really, really great album. Wish You Were Here. It starts out with Shine On You Crazy Diamond parts 1 through 5 and ends with Shine On You Crazy Diamond parts 6 through 9, I believe. So it's got 9 parts to just one track, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, where if they had put it all together, it probably would not have even fit on one side of an album. And then there's 3 other tracks on it. Everything on this album is good. There's a track on here that's actually sung by Roy Harper called Have a Cigar. And that kind of works because the character that Roy Harper plays is sort of like one of the people that produce, that produces the groups and stuff, and it works out right that he's not a member of the band, because it's almost like he's telling them how he's going to make them famous and all this stuff. So it works out really well. Wish You Were Here was an excellent single. The lyrics are just very awe-inspiring. Welcome to the Machine is really out there, a lot of synthesizer. And Shine On You Crazy Diamond is an excellent tribute to Syd Barrett. It is just like nothing else they've ever done. That's where that one sits. The next one, Animals. This one and the next one, which is number 1, is it can flip-flop at times. This is a truly, truly fantastic album. And although Roger Waters had pretty much taken over the group, as far as writing at least entirely, this still musically it sounds like a group effort. It's got basically 3 tracks. It does have a little opening track and a little closing track, but basically there's just 3 big tracks: dogs, pigs, 3 different ones, and sheep. And every one of them is fantastic. And the opening and closing with the 2 mellow acoustic guitar piece, just that's icing on the cake. This is a truly, truly, truly fine album. It has a very downbeat subject matter. In fact, it's sort of a musical homage to George Orwell's Animal Farm, but maybe a little more political. It is really, really a good album. This album, Wish You Were Here, Dark Side of the Moon, any of those I would recommend for somebody who's really wanting to get into Pink Floyd. And if you want to get into their earlier, my recommendation is the next album. My number 1, Metal. Metal is an album I loved from the first time I heard it. It's really, really unique. It's still very much a band effort. Side 1 has like 5 songs. The top one being One of These Days, the track opener, is pretty darn amazing. And then there's 3 regular vocal songs. The first track's an instrumental, except for there's a little bit of spoken part in the very middle. Then you got the 3 songs, and then there's this kind of bluesy thing that's kind of a joke, with some dogs howling and stuff in it. And then side two is like what I consider Pink Floyd's absolute masterpiece, Echoes. It's a sidelong track, just like Atom Heart Mother, but it's very cohesive. It is really, really an excellent track. And this is my favorite Pink Floyd album. Now I thought I'd show some of the things that Pink Floyd has done since. This is a reworking of Animals, and if you think Animals isn't got great production values, which some argue that it doesn't, this, which came out in I think it was written in 2018, but it didn't come out till like 2022, maybe 2021, 2022. This is mixed differently, and it really, really is an excellent version of the album. There's just a lot of it's very intricately done. So if you like Animals but don't quite care much for the production value, check this one out. They also did a version of Dark Side of the Moon that has vinyl that is a picture disc, but so that it would sound just as good as any of their other albums, instead of doing it like a normal picture disc, they did it as two separate vinyl pieces. When you take it out, it looks like a regular copy of Dark Side of the Moon, but the albums themselves are on clear vinyl, and they're only playable on one side. The other side of the album is just smooth vinyl with a little bit of artwork, and that way the album absolutely has great sound. It does mean that when you play it, you'll be playing two separate albums instead of one if you want to hear the whole album, but it really, really sounds fantastic. But anyway, that is my video on Pink Floyd. And in the future, I'm going to be doing some more rating albums. But although I did all their albums here, I think I'm probably going to be doing a lot of these groups that I listened to growing up based on their albums during their classic period. Just because I know those periods better. Now, groups like Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer and stuff, I've heard some of the stuff since then, but I'm going to concentrate on probably their classic era for the most part. But we'll see how that goes. Anyway, that's my take on Pink Floyd. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.